Hello everyone. Tonight we'll quietly slip past the velvet curtains of royal chambers, where flickering candlelight cannot hide the filth once clinging to every brocade gown and jewel-encrusted crown. Just imagine this with me. You're standing on cold marble floors, the scent of roses and amber drifting around your nose until it collides with something foul, sickly sweet, and ancient enough to sting your eyes. In this place, time seems frozen. And hygiene, well, you probably wouldn't survive a week without begging for a single bath. We're about to explore the hidden corners few dare to mention, castles where lice were as abundant as diamonds, where beauty rituals quietly poisoned the most powerful women in the world, and where the pursuit of perfection turned into a nightmare no fairy tale would dare to tell. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy what I'm doing here. And by the way, leave a comment to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your little corner of the world. Now, turn off a few lights. Maybe let a fan hum in the background. And let's begin tonight's journey together. You walk slowly down a thickly carpeted hallway, the light from hundreds of flickering candles casting glimmers across cold stone walls, reflecting off gold-embroidered tapestries and portraits of queens with proud eyes. But pause for a second, because what you just inhaled wasn't floral fragrance. It was a pungent blend of sweat, lead-based makeup soaked into the skin, and months of accumulated grime that had never been scrubbed clean. At the end of the hallway, there's a heavy door leading into the royal bath chamber. Of course, calling it a bathroom is generous. It was really just a damp little room where wooden tubs were filled with boiling water starting at midnight. Imagine 20 servants hunched over, hauling heavy buckets of water, then bowing to line the tub with linen cloth to prevent eye splinters from piercing the queen's skin. And despite all that effort, this ritual bath only took place once a month. Queen Elizabeth I, admired across Europe for her wisdom and power, had in fact gone weeks without her skin touching water. And when she finally descended into the wooden tub, the layers of lead-based face paint, as thick as plaster, we began to peel off in chunks. The metallic stench of lead mixed with vinegar and long-standing sweat rose like someone had opened the lid of an improperly sealed embalming jar. You stand nearby, trying not to cough. Most newly appointed maids fainted the first time they witnessed this scene, but the experienced ones knew to mentally brace themselves and to stuff flower-scented cloths in their noses to keep from retching. When the queen stepped out of the tub, her skin was blotched red, riddled with sores from years of lead poisoning. But more terrifying still, after drying her off, the maids carefully applied another layer of Venetian cerusia cream made from white lead and vinegar on her face. No cleaning off the old layer, just smearing a fresh one over it. Day after day, this toxic mask thickened, sealing off every pore, gradually eroding Elizabeth's memory, making her prone to sudden fits of rage, and eventually causing most of her hair to fall out. But wait, that was just one of many tragedies. Picture this. You follow the queen into the audience chamber. Lords and ladies of the court bow deeply, silk and brocade gowns brushing the marble floor. They incline their heads, gloved hands perfumed, smiles warm. But beneath those gloves are hands covered in tiny bite marks, the legacy of royal lice. Lice weren't just occasional pests. In the palace, they were as common as dust. They nested in coats, huts, even on the velvet seats of council chairs. Sometimes, just a 10-minute conversation was enough for something to start crawling from your collar to your nape. Lady Anne Clifford once recorded that after visiting a nobleman's room, just sitting and chatting briefly, her whole family ended up making friends with lice. Back then, it was routine. People merely shrugged, brushed off their hems, and tried to pretend they weren't scratching. During formal ceremonies, the soft rustling of fingers discreetly scratching echoed like a secret chorus. Things got even worse when you looked up at the enormous wigs worn by noblewomen. To keep the hair styled, they applied a coat of fat pig lard or fresh bear grease. This, combined with body heat, turned their heads into ideal incubators for insect colonies. Lice laid eggs in the powder and grease, and tiny bugs scurried in and out in search of food. And let's not forget those dainty little sticks the ladies always carried, ornate scratching wands made of ivory or silver. They use them to probe through the layers of their wigs and scratch their itchy, infested scalps. Honestly, if you watched long enough, you could easily spot who was battling a nest of lice at the nape of their neck. Amid all this, royalty and nobility still prided themselves on their refinement. They masked the filthy truth with perfumes so strong they could choke the uninitiated. Stories claim that at Versailles, every step Queen Marie Antoinette took left a trail of overpowering scent musk and ambergris, but that fragrance was only a desperate mask to hide the reality. Beneath the glittering gowns was sweat, rat droppings, skin sores, and teeming lice. And then, at night, the rooms of Versailles became a maze of stench, with over 0 people crammed in, too few toilets, no proper sewage. Every corner bore the marks of despair, dried urine stains, piles of waste hastily covered with sand or ash. Nobles in brocade worth a fortune would relieve themselves right there, just lifting a layer of skirt and pretending to admire a painting on the wall. When you imagine this scene, don't forget one simple truth. They all believed they were living at the pinnacle of human civilization. They thought this lifestyle proved their supreme power, their superiority over commoners, and they were willing to endure lice, lead poisoning, and disease just to maintain that perfect image. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you're wearing a silk gown that weighs 10 kilograms, a half-meter tall wig on your head, surrounded by air thick with the scent of perfume mixed with sweat. Beneath your feet, a velvet carpet soaked with the traces of thousands of unclean footsteps. You still have to smile, bow, and pretend that everything is wonderful. That is the greatest tragedy. They weren't just trapped in gilded cages, they were forced to believe it was heaven. If you're still conscious after all those images, take a deep breath and brace yourself, because tonight's story is only just beginning. Let's pause at a particular scene that even history books often shy away from. You're in Hanover, watching Countess Platen submerged halfway in a tub of fresh cow's milk in the dim candlelight. Her skin is ulcerated, bruised, likely from a disease historians now believe to be syphilis, a plague that spread through Europe's nobility like a dark curse. But the terrifying part isn't that she bathed in milk to heal herself. It's that after each bath, the milk wasn't discarded. It was donated to the poor. Imagine a starving family, freezing in the cold, waiting for a gift from the castle. They receive a pail of cloudy milk, eyes lighting up with hope. That liquid would nourish their children through the winter, or so they believed. No one told them the milk was saturated with pus from the countess's wounds, teeming with invisible bacteria waiting to enter the stomachs of the desperate. That wasn't an accident. It was distorted kindness, sweetened charity laced with poison. As if fate whispered, "You are poor, so your life is only worth spoiled milk." Leaving Hanover, we arrive at a darker chapter where not bathing was not just a habit, but a belief. Imagine you're living in 15th century Spain. Night falls, and in cold stone churches, priests preach that bathing is a temptation of the devil, that the body must suffer, must stink and be filthy to be worthy of God's love. If you were a Muslim forcibly converted, your daily cleansing rituals, once the core of your faith, immediately became evidence of heresy. From now on, even a clean barrel of water in your home was a danger, a bar of soap, a death sentence. If a neighbor whispered that they bathed too often, your family could be sent to the flames. Picture the moment: children huddled, hiding soap beneath straw mattresses, a mother trembling as she washes her hair in the dark, afraid a single drop might leave a trace on the ground. Outside, guards with torches patrol. A hint of fragrance, a shirt too white, could mean the fire that swallows your entire bloodline. After the Spanish conquered Granada, they didn't just force the locals to abandon their faith. They ordered the destruction of all public bathhouses used by Muslim structures that had stood for centuries, keeping whole cities free of disease. Soon after, Azlise, typhus, and plague spread. The priests declared, "This is God's punishment for sin." No, it's hard not to shudder at the absurdity. They turned hygiene into heresy. They turned suffering into proof of loyalty, and they turned people once proud of their cleanliness into trembling, filthy souls too afraid to avoid the pyre. That is a crime not only against humanity but against reason itself. Now let's return to Versailles, where all the grandeur and rot reached their peak. Beneath gold-gilded ceilings, you'll find a scene recorded by historian Tony Spawforth, Marie Antoinette quietly stepping across the inner courtyard, her silk gown brushing the stone floor. Then, from a high window, a bucket of waste poured down, splashing across her. In that moment, no perfume, no silk, no pearls could save the image of the powerful queen. She was just a woman, trembling in disgust and humiliation, standing in the castle once praised as the pinnacle of European civilization. Ember Day. You think it was an accident? No. It happened every day. With over 10,000 people crammed into a building without proper sewage, Versailles became a reeking maze. Women walked the halls, lifting their skirts to urinate directly on the floor. Men casually defecated over balconies. The marble staircases gleamed, but beneath your feet were dry yellow streaks and piles of feces hastily covered with ash. It's said that, to conceal the truth, the royal court issued orders to scatter herbs, dried flowers, and find perfumes everywhere. But the result was a horrific mixture: roses, musk, human waste, long-standing sweathinging thick in the air, seeping into everyone's hair and clothes. The children born at Versailles grew up with that smell. They learned to speak, walk, and bow while standing on stained floors. They never knew what a truly clean room felt like. And the tragedy was, they thought it was normal. Imagine a royal banquet, with Louis XIV receiving envoys from distant lands, in a grand hall glowing with silver candlelight. He raises his hand in blessing, eyes meeting those of trembling guests, because the stench was enough to make one retch. As wine ripples in crystal glasses, the sewage pipes above begin to leak, dripping down into the kitchen beneath their feet. And yet, everyone had to pretend they were part of a sacred ritual. That was Versailles, a gilded cage filled with filth, microbes, and illusion. And perhaps the cruelest part was that all these people, from lead-painted queens to an unbathed king, believed they stood at the pinnacle of power. They believed themselves different, superior, more refined than the common folk. But beneath the gowns, the fragrance, and the ceremony, they were merely decaying bodies, slowly drowning in their own delusion. If you're lying there, listening to this story under the soft light of your night lamp, imagine this. How long would you last in Versailles, where every breath is a test of your nerves? An hour? A day? Or would you not survive even a single night? When we think of European palaces in the Middle Ages or Renaissance, we often picture gilded halls, stately portraits, and grand marble columns. But if a time machine dropped you into Versailles or Whitehall, what would shock you most wouldn't be the opulence. It would be the simplest question: where did they go to the bathroom? Let's start with Versailles itself, the symbol of French power. One would think there'd be hundreds of proper toilets, given the sheer number of people there around the clock. But no, the number of official lavatories was shockingly low. The reason was quite noble. To build toilets was to openly admit that humans had bodily needs, a fact that would diminish the dignity of the palace. So what did they do? The honest answer is anywhere. If you were a noblewoman, wearing layers of silk at a 7-hour banquet in nature called, you weren't allowed to leave. So you had one option: discreetly lift your skirts, sit right there, and place a bordelais small, oval porcelain chamber pot between your legs. These pots were so delicately crafted they looked like teapots from afar, decorated with white glaze and elegant gold trim. As violinists played, you'd smile sweetly and relieve yourself. Once done, a maid would bend down, lift the pot, carry it across the hall hidden under a lace cloth, and quietly pour its contents into a large urn at the end of the corridor, the communal waste bin of Versailles. As for the gentlemen, their method was more direct. They often slipped into empty hallways, or simply opened a balcony window and urinated into the Queen's rose garden. One tale recounts how Marie Antoinette once walked through the courtyard and was splashed with a full bucket of urine from above, not out of malice, just because someone was relieving themselves. As usual, if you were a first-time guest at Versailles, you'd quickly notice the distinct stench lingering everywhere from the reception rooms to the spiral staircases. It wasn't just the smell of people, it was a bizarre compound of musky perfume, long fermented sweat, the damp rot of antique wood, and human waste. When the number of bordeleus was no longer sufficient, the court adopted the policy of every corner is a toilet. A letter from an English visitor recorded, "It is not uncommon to see ladies and gentlemen relieving themselves in the grand hallway. Some place a candle on the windowsill, bend over to urinate down the stairs, then adjust their coat and walk away as if nothing had happened." They and the king, Louis XIV, the Sunday king, never mingled with the crowd. He had his own personal toilet, the closed stool, a finely carved wooden chair lined with red velvet cushions. Beneath it was a drawer containing a porcelain chamber pot. Every morning, the groom of the stool, his designated servant, had to inspect the king's stool for temperature, consistency, and color, not out of mere curiosity, but to assess the health of the nation. As unbelievable as it sounds, the groom of the stool held one of the most powerful positions in court. When the king sat on his stool, he often discussed confidential matters, signed decrees, or revealed state secrets. The one kneeling behind him, holding the cloth, wielded power akin to a prime minister. Historians have joked, the French court had two thrones, one to rule the world, the other to relieve oneself. And truly, both were equally important. What about Elizabeth I, the famed English queen who shunned bathing but had a portable toilette, a mother-of-pearl inlaid chair with a large brass chamber pot beneath it? It's believed sitting on that toilet throne helped ease her stomach pain caused by years of ingesting lead-based cosmetics. Still, her maids had to kneel beside her, enduring the stench of vinegar, sweat, and feces. Perhaps most shocking of all were the strict rituals surrounding defecation. When the king wished to use his close stool, a guard would announce loudly in the hall, "Sa Majesté est indisposée." His Majesty needs to relieve himself. Everyone had to bow, turn away, and remain completely silent. Even emptying the chamber pot was a diplomatic affair. If you were a foreign envoy invited to the morning lever du roi, the king's waking ceremony, you might be granted the honor of witnessing the king go to the toilet. This event was considered a supreme privilege, a symbol of royal trust. One Venetian diplomat wrote, "We were honored to see all things of His Majesty, even the most private, to mask the smell. Braziers of burning coal, amber, and ambergris were placed beneath the stool, but the mixture only made things worse, as if one were inhaling a sewer on fire." In Spain during the Inquisition, things were much worse. Religious obsession turned hygiene into sin if one was too clean. Using water to cleanse the anus was banned, called a carnal indulgence. As a result, most nobles used dry cloths or fireplace ash. Infected anal wounds were common, but to complain was to risk being accused of heresy. These stories may make you nauseous, but for them, it was the norm. Just like how women wore 10-kilogram gowns lined with cotton meant to absorb bodily fluids, they called it subtle charm. In Versailles, at night, most of the ground floor became a massive latrine. Feces containers were hauled away on wooden carts, rumbling through the halls all night. The stench seeped into wooden walls, velvet carpets, and bed linens. Courtier awoke, put on perfumed robes, walked through corridors reeking of waste, and pretended they were living in paradise. That was Versailles, a place where power and decay coexisted, where people told themselves they were the most civilized in the world, even as they stepped through the excrement of their peers. You might think that beneath all the velvet, jewels, and crowns, queens would be cared for most delicately during their menstruation. In truth, the reality was far more grotesque, a filthy nightmare wrapped beneath wide skirts. Imagine, you are a young duchess, only 15, just married to a king twice your father's age. The entire court watches your every move, every frown, every suspicious stain on your dress becomes the subject of gossip. And then comes your first period after entering this political marriage. You have no right to hide, no excuse to rest. So what did they do? First, you must understand that disposable menstrual pads didn't exist. Across much of Europe, noble women used rough cloth pads called cloudscut from linen or leftover fabric scraps. These were layered, placed between the legs, tied with cords around the waist, and covered with multiple skirts. Now imagine wearing a petticoat as thick as a blanket, a 10 kilogram over skirt, and a corset cinching your waist. All of this pressing against your cramping lower abdomen during lengthy ceremonies. Changing the cloth was nearly impossible. The iron scent of menstrual blood, mixed with sweat and damp fabric, rose and seeped into the layers of clothing. Yet during royal rituals, no one was allowed to show discomfort. The ladies merely bowed their heads, hiding their pain behind polite smiles. In Versailles, where everything was exaggerated to the extreme, it was even worse. Due to the lack of private toilets, women had to change their pads in their rooms, often only behind a folding screen. Water was scarce, sometimes just a single small basin so soiled cloths couldn't be washed immediately. They were wrapped in handkerchiefs and stuffed into wooden chests until the end of the dia, slow-growing nest of bacteria, waiting to spark infections. Worse still, the cold and damp European climate, combined with the many layered dresses, turned that region into a haven for fungi and bacteria. Many women lived with chronic infections without ever knowing why. Some nobles, more cautious, lined their garments with poorly treated sheepskin to prevent leaks. But the skin quickly stank, especially after being worn non-stop through days of unbroken ceremonies. Servants had to sprinkle fireplace ash or herbs to mask the odor. History also records cases of public accident stains of blood on light-colored gowns that sent the entire court into hushed whispers. A French countess once wrote in her diary, "I wanted to cry when I saw the deep red stain on my velvet dress. But I wasn't allowed to leave the ball. I had to stand there for 3 more hours, pretending not to notice." Oh, if you think this only happened to the middle class, you're mistaken. Queen Elizabeth, infamous for her discretion and strict etiquette, was no exception. Beneath her heavy gown, she still had to insert rough cloth pads and change them during private meetings. Records from her attendants note that the smell of blood mixed with lead powder and vinegar created a stench so indescribable. New maids had to train themselves not to faint. And let's not forget, during their periods, women also suffered from cramps, back pain, dizziness, but they weren't allowed to rest, because society believed a queen must always be strong, pure, never weak like common women. So they endured, even with intense lower abdominal pain. They had to receive guests, smile, and bow when the king passed. To show discomfort was to be deemed undignified. In Spain, things were even worse. The Inquisition believed that menstrual blood was impure, so women were forbidden from approaching sacred places. Yet at the same time, they weren't allowed to isolate themselves or stop working. The result? They had to wrap soiled cloth tightly, conceal the smell, and continue kneeling in prayer as if nothing had happened. The fear of being smelled, of revealing a stain became a lifelong obsession. Some records tell of ladies using perfume so strong it overwhelmed the servants just to mask the very human, very natural scent of blood. Another rarely mentioned detail, with their enormous wigs, tightly laced corsets, and multi-layered skirts, women often couldn't change their pads by themselves. They had to ask a maid for help. In a silent, deeply awkward ritual, it all took place in a small room, under dim candlelight, as the scents of bear grease, lead powder, and blood blended into one. When it was done, the maid would silently wrap the cloth in a handkerchief and place it in a wooden chest. No one said a word. Only a brief glance passed between Thima's silent acknowledgement, never voiced aloud. We are all trapped in this rotting ritual. R.A., you may be lying there, listening to this story, feeling disgusted. But for them, it was everyday life. The price of a crown, the proof that even wrapped in gowns worth a fortune, you were still human with primal needs that could not stay hidden beneath layers of silk forever. You might think that if they wore fine silk and lived in gold-gilded palaces, at least they dined with elegance and cleanliness. In truth, their meals were both a performance of power and a battle between man and microbe. Picture a typical banquet at Versailles. Long tables stretched across the grand hall, covered with white embroidered linens. Hundreds of silver platters served dishes like honey-braised venison, Holden roast goose, herb-rubbed wild boar, dried fruit tarts, and rose petal preserves. Sounds delicious. But now imagine, in that room, there was no concept of washing hands before eating. People ate mostly with their fingers. Forks were used to serve, not to eat. By the end of the meal, everyone's hands were greasy, coated with sauces and breadcrumbs. You wouldn't find paper napkins. Each guest had a large cloth napkin, which they used throughout the feast to wipe their mouths, their hands, and to blow their noses. After a few hours, that napkin turned into a filthy rag, but no one found it strange. The only hand-washing water available was a communal bowl of orange blossom water passed around. They dipped their fingertips in it, wiped briefly, then went right back to grabbing food. Just picture a long table of dozens of people all dipping their hands into the same bowl and you'll understand just how delighted the bacteria at Versailles must have been. You ask if the royal kitchens were sanitary? That's the part that would make modern people's skin crawl. The massive royal kitchen was always sweltering, blackened with smoke. Meat hung for days on wooden hooks, its surface crawling with flies. Cooks would simply slice off the blackened, rotten layer, assuming the inside was still good. Strong spices like pepper, cloves, and cinnamon were used not just for flavor but to mask the stench of spoilage. To them, dining was a ritual of status. The more dishes, the more elaborate and ornate the presentation, the more luxurious it seemed. But the concept of food hygiene simply didn't exist. The drinking water wasn't any cleaner. Despite having wine and spirits, the royals and nobility still drank well, water strained through cloth. In many castles, water was delivered through lead pipes leaking toxins for decades. Those with weaker constitutions suffered stomach pains, swelling, Zeitzuhus, and eventually died of mysterious illnesses. But no one ever suspected the faded pipe running through the cold stone wall. A journal entry from the Earl of Devonshire recalls, "We dined with His Majesty. The dampness of roast meat, sweet wine, and the stench of human waste from the lower corridor merged into an atmosphere difficult to describe." They weren't exaggerating. For all its splendor, Versailles lacked a proper sewage system for 10,000 people. Waste built up beneath the kitchen floor, seeping through the stone cracks. Every grand feast came with its own invisible seasoning that no one dared name. Here's another little-known detail. At royal meals, there were no standards for washing dishes with hot water and soap. Scullery workers merely rinsed plates in cold water and wiped them dry with cloth. If grease stuck too thickly, They scraped it off with a knife, so those shiny silver plates might sparkle on the outside but still reeked of fat and held crusted residue. So why didn't they get food poisoning all the time? Actually, they did. But medicine had no clue why. When epidemics struck, people blamed bad air, God's wrath, or the influence of ill-favored stars. No one suspected the real culprit sat right on their plates: rancid meat, lead-laced wine, and a shared towel soaked with 10 people's sweat. Now imagine you're a young countess, newly arrived at Versailles. You're wearing a heavy velvet dress, your corset tightening around your stomach. You're required to attend a 6-hour banquet in a space thick with the odors of grease, perfume, and humanity. You aren't allowed to leave, even as your gut twists from the spoiled meat and syrupy wine. Next to you, a gentleman coughs violently, sickness spreading from the kitchen, where rats rummage through flour barrels each night. When the feast ends, your maid escorts you back to your room where there are no showers, no scented soaps, just a basin of cloudy cold water, the same one the whole floor used to wash hands after dinner. You dip a cloth, scrub the grease from your wrist, and collapse into bed. The next day, it repeats. No one questions it because this was the pinnacle of civilization. If you've ever heard Versailles praised as the most refined heart of Europe, remember, behind every glittering banquet were hundreds of fly nests, moldy meat scraps, wine thick with lead, and exhausted servants scrubbing dishes that were never truly clean. That's the truth no oil painting dares to show. You've heard me tell of lead powder eating away skin, lice crawling through wigs, and Versailles feasts soaked in rancid grease. But perhaps nothing unnerves the modern mind more than how they cared for their teeth, or rather, how they didn't. Let's begin with a familiar image: the portrait of Queen Elizabeth I. With ghostly white skin and tightly closed lips, she was praised as the Virgin Queen, pure, powerful, but few dared say aloud that one reason she rarely smiled was because her teeth were nearly rotten. Elizabeth adored sugar to the point that every meal included rose petal preserves, sweet pastries, and hard candies. At the time, sugar was the ultimate symbol of wealth. The more you consumed, the more powerful you appeared. But the price of that sweet glory was blackened teeth. When a French ambassador visited her court, he wrote in a letter about a foul breath and teeth as dark as coal. Just imagine a queen famed for her power, seated on the throne, opening her mouth and unleashing a stench beyond description. How could they let it get that bad? Simply put, because the concept of daily toothbrushing didn't exist. In England, if you were careful, you might use a sharp stick called a toothpick to dislodge food. Nobles wore silver toothpicks at their hips like jewelry. After meals, they would casually chat while picking meat from between their teeth. But once the food was removed, that was it, no rinsing. Some refined individuals wiped their teeth with silk cloths. In some places, servants mixed charcoal powder with salt for their masters to rub on their teeth in hopes of whitening them. The result? Enamel eroded, yellow dentin exposed, and teeth gradually fell out. If you were a French queen, you might use eau de toilette, a mouthwash made of strong alcohol and herbs. But it didn't kill bacteria. It simply masked odors, temporarily, like spraying perfume on a garbage heap. In Spain, where religion governed all, many noble women believed that caring too much for teeth was vain, against humility. So they let their teeth rot. Loose, blackened teeth were seen as rewards of piety. At Versailles, where body odor and trash filled every corridor, bad breath became so common that it shaped a new social custom: the etiquette of distance. If you look at old paintings, you'll notice nobles never stand face to face. They kept 2 to 3 steps apart, not just for decorum, but because no one wanted to smell each other's breath. Records tell of King Louis XIV receiving guests, while diplomats discreetly held perfumed cloths to their noses. A Venetian envoy once wrote, His Majesty's breath was so foul my eyes began to water. The terrible irony was, the wealthier they were, the more sugar they consumed, hastening the destruction of their teeth. By the end of their lives, many nobles couldn't chew at all. They had to eat porridge or heavily stewed meals. Some countesses became famous for their golden teeth, not from care, but because jewelers had wrapped their rotting teeth in gold leaf to preserve appearances. That gold protected nothing. It was just a shiny cover for festering roots and inflamed gums. Others opted for tooth extractions. But at the time, extractions were a last resort. No anesthesia, no sterilization. Barbers, blacksmiths, or traveling healers would use iron pliers to wrench out teeth. Every pull carried a high risk of infection. Many died from shock or sepsis. Curious what they did once their teeth were all gone? The answer is dentures, but not the modern kind. They used human teeth from corpses or horse teeth, filed down to fit the gums and strapped in with metal wires. The stench of rotting gums mingled with rusting metal wires, creating a breath that made others turn away. At Versailles, there was a trend of chewing anise seeds or cinnamon bark to mask odors. Queens and courtiers kept them in their sleeves, crunching them between ceremonies. But like perfume, it was just another layer covering the rot. Now picture this: a royal banquet night. Hundreds of ladies and lords laughing, speaking, chewing roast meat and sugary desserts. Their rancid breath spreads through the gold-leafed ballroom, weaving together into an invisible veil. Still, everyone smiles, bows, raises a toast, and pretends this is the height of civilization. If you've ever wondered why royal portraits so rarely show smiles, this is why. It wasn't that they were cold. Behind those tightly closed lips were rotting teeth and breath like a tomb, truths no one wished to expose. So, the next time you place your toothbrush on the sink, when the scent of mint toothpaste fills your mouth, remember, you're living in an age more civilized than kings. A fresh breath each day is a gift Queen Elizabeth or Louis XIV could never afford. You've journeyed with me through the rot of royal feasts, the decay of their mouths, and the filthy rituals wrapped in velvet. But one more thing contributed to the unforgettable scent of Versailles: the grand chambers that were never truly clean. Imagine this: you walk through the grand gates of Versailles, flanked by rose gardens and sunlit fountains. But when you push open the heavy, carved doors and step into the main hall, you realize that all this splendor is just a thin veil masking something deeply human. Start with the floors. Versailles once prided itself on the rarest velvet and wool carpets in Europe, but they were rarely cleaned. These rugs absorbed dust, urine, breadcrumbs. Mouse fur then clung to it in every woven strand. The mildew mingled with body odor and waste, forming an accidental base perfume. Some accounts mention that with each step on the carpet, you'd hear the crunch of dried insects, chestnut shells, and rat droppings. Yet the courtiers held their heads high, pretending this was the height of civilization. At night, rats swarmed the halls. They climbed onto dining tables, gnawed at crumbs, dragged away stews. Servants said that if lights weren't left on, they'd find greasy rat footprints across the room by morning. But catching rats wasn't a priority. By old belief, rats in the palace were a sign of abundance, for if food weren't plentiful, they wouldn't come. Curious how they cleaned. Each morning, guards would sweep the halls, but lacking proper tools. They used crude brooms made of twigs. The sweeping stirred up dust, which settled again on velvet curtains and royal portraits. As for the heavier mess feces, urine stains, dropped food, those were simply covered with fireplace ash as temporary cleaning. In the royal bedchamber, a massive carved bed stood at the center. But don't be fooled into thinking it smelled sweet. Feather-stuffed mattresses, over the years, absorbed sweat, dead skin, lice, and bed bugs, so much so that servants had to beat the mattress each morning to knock out the bugs. then sweep and burn them. Historian Tony Spawforth once wrote, "The servants of Versailles considered bedbugs more familiar companions than the saints. Amber, some nobles, ever refined, slipped sachets of herbs beneath their pillows to mask the stench, but no one thought to wash the blankets or air out the mattresses. Removing the bedding was seen as shameful, exposing the filth beneath. Better to live with the smell than let others see." Curious about the curtains? Those heavy velvet drapes, thick with dust and moisture, were perfect hiding spots for lice, bugs, and mold. But washing them was nearly impossible. Taking them down alone could take a week. So servants merely dusted the outer layer. Inside, years of grime, insect droppings, and spiderwebs accumulated like relics of time. Another account described, when the curtain was drawn, a fine dust rose like mist. 0. And the wooden floors? You might see polished oak gleaming, but that sheen came from thick layers of linseed oil and beeswax meant to mask odor. Beneath the floorboards, food scraps had rotted for years. In one room, servants discovered mouse bones and biscuit crumbs dating back 7 winters. More curiously, Versailles had a rule forbidding the installation of fixed toilets, fearing it would ruin the elegance. Instead, hundreds of porcelain chamber pots were placed in corner cabinets. After use by guests and courtiers, servants would dump them carelessly, sometimes forgetting entirely. In some rooms, pots overflowed onto the floor and remained there for days, because everyone assumed it wasn't their responsibility. Imagine the mingling stench of old human waste, mold, and the faint scent of rosewater drifting near the curtains. In England, things weren't better. During the Tudor era, Whitehall Palace had a rule to spray perfume throughout the halls to cover the smell. But the mixture of musk, orange blossom, and damp air only emphasized the rot. One person described it, "Walking down those corridors felt like stepping through the belly of a giant beast long dead." Oh, one detail few mention. The dust in noble castles was uniquely toxic. It contained lead residue from makeup, arsenic flakes from paint, mouse fur, damp pollen, insect remains. Many people coughed and wheezed their whole lives, yet believed it was the price of high status. Laughs still. When guests arrived, hosts proudly led tours, showing off Persian rugs and gold-carved beds. No one said that under those beds, bedbugs waited for nightfall to bite. If you're lying there listening, take a look around your room, a clean space with a vacuum, soap, and fresh running water. Then imagine yourself in a velvet gown, breathing in mold and bedbugs every night. That was the royal tragedy, a life lived in luxury, without a single truly clean corner. As dawn breaks over the trees of Versailles, pale light slips through velvet curtains heavy with dust. The chapel bell rings in the distance. In a vast bedroom, a countess stirs, wincing at the musty smell around her pillow and the backache from the feather mattress unwashed for years. A maid enters, bows, and begins the hour-long waking ritual. First, she lights the hearth to warm the bedsheets, cold and damp as stone. Then she opens the wooden cupboard and retrieves the bordelaue, a small porcelain chamber pot adorned with delicate floral designs. In awkward silence, the mistress relieves herself while the maid turns away, pretending not to hear. Next comes grooming. The heavy wig, thick with bare grease, is carefully placed on the table, ready to be worn. But before that, the maid must tend to the mouth. No toothpaste, no brush, just a cloth dipped in strong liquor, rubbed over inflamed gums and fetid breath. Once the wig is donned, another servant applies white powder, fine as flour, leaving space around the eyes. Layers of lead rouge are painted onto cheeks and lips, creating a cold, noble face like a mask. She doesn't dare smile too wide for fear of exposing decayed teeth and a breath that even courtiers were used to avoiding. By 9 o'clock, the grand chambers open to receive courtiers. the sound of heeled shoes on wood, silk skirts brushing carpets. Everyone bows politely, hands discreetly holding scented handkerchiefs to their noses. If anyone forgets the safe distance, they are hit full on with a mix of strong perfume and unwashed bodies. The morning is filled with long-winded conversations: who's sleeping with whom, who's lost a tooth, who has a strange illness. But everyone pretends it's all refined, all dignified. By noon, the banquet begins. Over 100 dishes laid out along the great hall: venison, goose, smoked fish, honey cakes. No one washes hands before eating. Meat is torn with fingers, mouths wiped on shared cloth napkins also used to blow noses. Bad breath rises and mingles, thick with the smell of spoiled meat, grease, and sweat. The stench of the sewer below mixes with musk perfume, making newcomers dizzy. But if you show any sign of disgust, the entire hall will take it as an insult. After the meal, lords and ladies rise, fingers greasy, faces streaked with powder. They wander the halls or gardens to aid digestion. If someone needs relief, they simply slip to a corner, place a small pot, and pretend they're admiring the flowers. The afternoon was reserved for diplomatic protocol. Ambassadors lined up to be received by the lord of the castle. But every greeting occurred from a distance of 3 paces, because no one wanted to breathe in the stench of rotting teeth. In the audience chamber, dark velvet curtains hid the rats that darted across the floor. Everyone pretended not to see. By late afternoon, as the light faded, servants stoked the fireplaces, but the smoke mingled with fine dust from the carpets and soot, filling the room with a choking like banal, burnt odor. At that moment, the host might chew a few aniseeds to mask their breath. Meanwhile, the bedbugs in the feather mattress began to stir, preparing for their nightly feast. In the evening, they gathered again for the ball. The orchestra played in the candlelit grand hall. Ladies swept their dresses across wooden floors littered with cigarette ash, crumbs, and rat droppings. Gentlemen bowed to offer a dance hands no cleaner than at lunch. If you looked closely, you'd notice no one dared to smile too wide. A broad grin would reveal a mouth half empty of teeth, chipped gold caps, swollen gums. Instead, they curled their lips into a faint smirk, always maintaining a safe distance. When the clock struck midnight, the couples, weary, left the ballroom for their private chambers. Servants quietly lit incense to mask the layered stench. Ambergris, smoke, phrases, and sweat blended into a thick fog that clung to the halls. In the dark, the countess removed her silk gown, revealing the thick underlayer stained with dried menstrual blood that hadn't been changed all day. The maid removed her wig, picked lice from her nape, then placed the hairpiece on its wooden stand where the bugs would continue laying eggs through the night. She lay down on the musty feather mattress, eyes closed, trying to ignore the skittering of insects beneath the fabric. And so the day ended among velvet, dust, stench, and layers of well-practiced pretension. You've heard me speak of lice-filled wigs, decayed mouths, rancid meals, and foul-smelling velvet drapes. But one thing determined it all: education. You might think they were taught the finest things. In truth, in many royal courts, noble education was both a point of pride and a tragedy that buried entire generations. Picture a gloomy morning at Versailles. A 6-year-old noble boy, destined to become a duke, is awoken by a bell. A servant dresses him in heavy brocade, then leads him to a dark-paneled study. There, a private tutor waits. He might be a priest, or an out-of-work scholar hired by the noble family, just for formality. All morning, the boy reads Latin scripturessa, language he doesn't understand, but must memorize for family honor. Noble education emphasized 3 things. Ye, know your rank. R, bow correctly. San, recite a few old texts to impress him. The court valued etiquette over practical knowledge. So, the boy was taught how to tilt his head at the right angle, how to rest his hand on a sword hilt, how to dab his nose with a scented cloth when speaking to someone of lower status. As for math, science, geography, those were mere decoration. A French gentleman once wrote, "I'd rather my son starve than learn lowly trades like craftsmanship." No, the only books many noble households embraced were family genealogies, memorized lineages tracing back to ancient kings, used to boast of their pure bloodline. No, for noble girls, education was even more peculiar. From a young age, they were taught how to sit so that the dress covered their ankles, how to smile with closed lips to hide chipped teeth, how to walk slowly enough so the crown wouldn't tilt. Most importantly, the art of embroidery and modesty, the skill of pretending to be horrified by anything vulgar. Even though behind closed doors, they still spat after chewing spoiled meat. Some luckier girls learned a little music. Harps, clavecins just to show off at evening soiree. After performing, they returned to their musty rooms, lay on bedbug-infested feather mattresses, and waited for an arranged marriage. So don't assume all nobles were wise. Many dukes and counts lived their whole lives without knowing basic arithmetic, without understanding maps, unable to write a letter beyond the usual phrases. I, the humble one blessed by God with pure lineage. Some studied for years just to learn to sign their names properly. Part of this tragedy lay in collective arrogance. They believed status alone sufficed. They thought blue blood in their veins was proof enough of superiority over common folk. So, while craftsmen read books, explored new technique, and learned languages, many nobles locked themselves inside a glass cage of etiquette. In Inquisition era Spain, education was even more distorted. Noble children were taught to hate Jews, Muslims, anyone impure. Books on medicine and Greek philosophy were deemed dangerous. If you showed curiosity in science, you risked being accused of heresy. In English castles, some noble sons had the privilege of attending Oxford or Cambridge, but don't be fooled. They mostly went there to hone swordsmanship, drink, and flaunt family prestige. Reading was secondary. A record from the Stuart era stated, a young nobleman returns from school, his mind full of drink, his mouth full of Latin, but his heart utterly empty. You ask, was there anyone who truly loved learning? Yes, but they were seen as oddities. Anyone too passionate about knowledge was rumored to be mad, unfit for noble society. This is the subtlest tragedy. A system of education that only taught how to act. A hierarchy where intellect was considered shameful. A generation confident in their superiority, yet knowing nothing beyond how to bow and flaunt titles. If you're lying in bed tonight listening to this story, remember, your greatest privilege isn't bloodline, isn't ancestry, it's the ability to truly learn. Because knowledge needs no certificate of lineage. It only needs an open mind and a heart unafraid of being labeled heretical. Astri, you've heard me speak of lice-infested wigs, rancid meals, and rotting mouths. But among all these tragedies, perhaps the most terrifying was Royal Medicinia system, noble in name, but in practice, a game of chance. Imagine, you are a countess at Versailles. One winter morning, you wake with a burning fever, a swollen throat, a head splitting with pain. In the 21st century, it might be a mild flu, but in the 17th century, it could easily be a death sentence. Servants panic and rush to summon the royal physician. He arrives in a long black cloak, solemn-faced, carrying a leather bag filled with tools you'd rather not see. Scalpels, suction cups, iron clamps large as a blacksmith's. The idea of sterilizing tools barely existed. They believed disease came from bad air rising from the earth miasma. Surgical knives were reused on patient after patient. If your fever spiked, the first solution was phlebotomy, bloodletting. The physician drew a sharp blade and cut your vein. Blood streamed into a porcelain bowl. They believed that bad blood caused all illness. There are records of a noble patient being drained of more than a liter of blood in a single day after each session. The patient was left faint and pale, but the physician muttered, "Trust me. This is the only way to balance the humors. Amay, humor's blood. Flame. Yellow bile. Black bile were the foundation of medical belief. Every illness stemmed from an imbalance of these four fluids. So if bloodletting wasn't enough, the physician would prescribe herbs and mercury. You heard right, mercury was considered a cure, all. For everything from syphilis to headaches, but it slowly destroyed the nervous system, sending patients into delirium. If you had malaria, they'd place a vinegar-soaked rag, wilted herbs, and rice powder on your belly, then add a live frog. Why? They believed the frog would absorb the poison. Light. If you coughed, they'd burn a handful of goat hair and waft the smoke into your nostrils. If you couldn't stand the stench, you were encouraged to swallow a drop of mercury to sterilize from within. Light. In childbirth, the tragedy was even greater. A noblewoman nearing labor would be laid on a wooden bed. The midwife often untrained used rough hands to check dilation. Her only tools, a string, a cutting knife, herbs soaked in strong liquor. No gloves, no anesthesia, no disinfection. Countless women died from postpartum infections. They called it by a chillingly simple name, childbed fever. If a newborn seemed weak, it was baptized urgently. No one believed it would survive the night. Those who survived still had to rest on old feather mattresses soaked in blood, sweat, and bacteria, waiting for the next infection to strike. When nobles aged, illness was inevitable. Gout from red meat, rheumatism from damp castles, syphilis passed from husband to wife, all treated with brutal methods. Physicians wrapped your legs in oily rags, pressed red-hot irons onto boils to burn the poison. They pulled decayed teeth with iron pliers, no anesthesia. They applied poultices made from rotting goat fat to draw out toxins. Oh, and everyone believed, the more blood spilled, the more acrid the smell. The more pain endured, the greater the hope of healing. There was a quieter tragedy, superstition disguised as medicine. When Louis XIV suffered from hemorrhoids, the entire court trembled. Each day, 40 doctors took turns advising him. Some suggested bloodletting, others enemas, others collective prayer. No one knew what worked, but everyone pretended they held the secret. The result? The illness worsened. The king grew weaker, but the physicians were still handsomely rewarded for their devoted service. No. In Spain, the church forbade autopsies. No one dissected corpses to understand death, so useless methods were repeated for generations. And no one dared to object. There was one more truth. Royal corpses were perfumed to mask the stench. Everyone pretended the deceased had passed peacefully. Even as the body leaked and bloated, it was the pinnacle of deception upheld by noble medicine for centuries. You've heard me recount outdated medicine. Lice-ridden Vicks, size meals laced with sewage. But perhaps the most terrifying chain wasn't bedbugs or disease, it was the web of rigid rules constraining every breath. If you were born a noble, from the moment your eyes opened, you were bound to an absurdly intricate codea system of etiquette as thick as a textbook, all to prove superior blood. Imagine you are a young count at Versailles. Each morning, before you're fully awake, a servant checks whether you're sleeping in the correct posture. Yes, even sleeping positions were regulated. Sleeping on your side was seen as a habit of the low-born. You had to lie on your back, hands folded over your abdomen, head tilted no more than 15 degrees. Why? So that if someone entered, you still appeared dignified. Diaz, every morning, the Lever du Roi King's awakening ceremony was the epitome of absurdity. King Louis XIV was not allowed to sit up by himself. First, guards inspected the room to ensure it was safe. Then, 100 individuals lined up to watch the king open his eyes. They bowed one by one, said good morning, and witnessed the monarch change his undergarments. Think about it. Where else does the entire court gather to watch someone get dressed? But if you didn't attend, it was considered an insult to the crown. Even the rules of bowing were meticulously codified. You couldn't bow too deeply unless you held a duke or marquis title. You couldn't bow too long if you outranked the other person. Bowing at the wrong angle could get you fined or banned from royal banquets. One count was once stripped of all privileges, including the right to sit at the main dining table simply because he failed to bow correctly to the queen. From then on, he had to stand in a corner of the hall, sneaking bites of dry bread for the rest of his life. Dining rules were no less strict. You couldn't take bites that were too large, showing teeth, while chewing was deemed vulgar. You couldn't drink more than 3 sips of wine in a row, more than that, and you'd be labeled uncouth. You weren't allowed to debone your fish by hand. You had to signal a servant to do it for you, even if you were trembling with hunger. The rules for conversation were so complicated that many chose silence instead. In Versailles, if you were speaking to someone of lower rank, you could look them in the eye. But if they outranked you, you had to look at their chest. If the person was the queen, you were only allowed to look at the floor. So don't be surprised that noble portraits always showed dull, detached eyes. They had spent their lives avoiding direct gaze. As for clothing rules, each rank had strict regulations for color, fabric, and cloak length. For example, dukes could wear purple velvet, marquises wore blue velvet, counts were limited to gray velvet. Nobles without titles could only wear dark wool or damask. If you dared wear the colors of a higher rank, consequences were severe. One countess was forced to kneel in the grand hall for 3 hours simply because she wore a lavish purple dress, forgetting that purple was reserved for dukes. Marriage rules were equally cruel. You couldn't choose your own partner. All marriages were arranged from childhood. If you fell in love with someone unworthy, you could be locked in a convent for life to protect family honor. In Inquisition-era Spain, such laws were fused with ruthless faith. You were required to attend Mass weekly, even if you were on your deathbed. Miss twice, and you were fined. Miss 3 times, and you might be investigated for heresy. Funeral customs were bizarre too. If your parents died, you had to wear black for 2 years. Every morning, you were expected to weep for half an hour before their portrait. Failure to cry or frown would spark rumors of immorality. Then, child rearing was just as rigid. Noble children had to memorize their family lineage and practice bowing by age 3. By 6, boys wore tight trousers, donned powdered wigs, and were taught to speak with the nasal Versailles accent. Girls had to walk slowly, smile quietly, and never raise their voices. If children misbehaved, spilled something on their dress, laughed too loud, they were locked in dark rooms and made to kneel for hours in penance. You see, these weren't just rules. They were invisible chains binding an entire class, turning them into lifelong performers trapped in a play of nobility, never allowed to live as free people. So, when you hear tales of Versailles banquets or glittering crowns, don't forget their darker side, the decay of the spirit, the quiet terror, and a lifetime taught that you must never break the rules, even at the cost of your happiness. You've heard me speak of lice-ridden wigs, meaningless rituals, and rigid rules. But if anything was more dazzling and rotten than the stench of an old feather mattress, it was royal politics. Imagine Versailles as a palace glowing with candlelight, gilded from ceiling to floor. But in truth, this was not just a place of leisure. It was a silent battlefield, where every greeting, every bow, every glance could determine the fate of thousands. At Versailles, politics did not take place in conference halls. It happened in beds, in royal bedrooms, beside the king's chamber pot, even during suffocating balls filled with the scent of sweat and powdered makeup. If you were a duke, your most important task was not mastering statecraft, but showing up at the exact moment the king awoke for the lever d'oreille. Those close to the king while he dressed and combed his hair had the chance to whisper suggestions, accuse rivals, or discreetly offer tempting favors. Some called Versailles a human grinder. One well-timed whisper could turn a count into a prime minister or exile him to the frontiers for life. Remember, royal politics was a game with no written rules, only unspoken codes, and anyone slow to catch on would be devoured. In Spain, politics was even stranger, because it was tightly bound to the church. If you wanted to rise, you had to flatter the king and also pretend to be devout to an extreme degree. One nobleman once donated his entire estate to the church, then secretly took out high-interest loans to maintain his lavish lifestyle. Everyone knew he was faking piety, but no one dared speak up. One accusation of heresy could see your whole family tied upside down on the pyre. Politics then wasn't about noble ideals. It was the art of performance, a contest of patience and deceit. If you were a noblewoman, the game was even darker. You weren't allowed a seat in council, but you still had a formidable weapon, power behind the curtain. The royal household was a maze of secret letters, arranged marriages, and clandestine affairs traded for favor. Records tell of a royal mistress who got 3 ministers dismissed just by whispering over dinner. The next morning, they were exiled without explanation. And the king? You think he held all the power? Not quite. He too was a prisoner of competing factions. Every morning, Louis XIV woke to hundreds of letters placed on his desk, each one a denunciation. Your Majesty. The Duke of X is plotting rebellion. Your Majesty. And the Marquis of Y is secretly dealing with English merchants. Your Majesty. The Count of Z mocked the Spanish. If the king trusted the wrong man, the court could fall into chaos. But if he ignored too many warnings, he'd be seen as weak. So each day, he had to choose his words carefully, balancing factions while securing his throne. That's why so many kings grayed faster than commoners. They lived in a forest of lies. Royal politics even birthed a peculiar profession, court espionage. In England, under Elizabeth the Primata, all royal correspondence was intercepted and read before reaching the recipient. A single vague phrase could become evidence of treason. One count was executed silently for writing about the Queen's declining health. In France, maids, cooks, wig makers, any of them could be spies. A careless word while changing the Queen's gown could reshape history. But perhaps the most terrifying part was this. Everything wore the disguise of elegant ritual. At a Versailles ball, while ladies curtsied and smiled sweetly, they weren't just vying for the king's gaze. They were measuring status, calculating alliances. A single glance could be a message. If you back me, I'll switch sides. Royal banquets looked like entertainment, but were actually quiet exchanges of power. You might wonder, why didn't they walk away from this cruel game? Because refusal was seen as betrayal. One would lose rank, land, and honor. In that society, it was better to be buried in intrigue than forgotten. So if tonight you're hearing this story, be quietly grateful. You don't have to wake each morning guessing who will stab you in the back. You don't need to wear purple velvet to prove you're better than others. You don't live in a palace of gold, constantly fearing for your head.